Yesterday was the 17th anniversary of the detonation of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 70 years ago, an irreversible decision was made that changed humanity since. After billions of dollars and research, years of development, a team led by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer successfully created the world's first atomic bombs. The weapons of mass destruction ultimately brought the end to World War II. This never-before-seen power resulted in fear across the globe.
Now, during the time before and during World War II, there were 4 different countries trying to develop an atomic bomb. Unknown to most people, America was not the first or the second. It was actually the third. The first was Germany, then ironically Japan, and then the United States, and then the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, in order for such programs and weapons of mass destruction to exist, someone had to have come up with the idea to make them. Now, obviously, the idea of the atomic bomb wasn't the makings of just one mastermind, but of many. But what we can say is the majority of their ideas probably sparked from the idea of one scientist. In fact, the most famous scientist ever, Albert Einstein. Now, even though he was a pacifist, he never actually worked on the atomic bomb himself. He made the equation that made everything possible. E equals mc squared. When Albert Einstein formulated his famous equation, E equals mc squared, in 1905, he changed the world as we know it. E equals mc squared stands for energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. This equation was revolutionary in the science community because it meant that we could theoretically turn matter into energy. Or in other words, we could harness the energy of the atom. However, at this time, there was no efficient way of doing so. Just breaking an atom apart required putting more energy into it than you would get out of it. In fact, Einstein said it himself, the likelihood of transforming matter into energy is akin to shooting birds in the dark in a country where there are only few birds. But as the years went by, scientists began to study the atom more closely, resulting in the discovery of the neutron. And in December of 1938, about 1 year before the start of World War II, 2 German scientists by the name of Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered the process known as nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is the process that makes the creation of the atomic bomb possible. Now, based off of E equals mc squared, nuclear fission occurs when a single neutron bombards an unstable atom such as uranium or plutonium. This extra neutron causes the atom to become even more stable and to split. This split releases energy and also an extra 3 neutrons. In a bomb, these 3 neutrons will go onto other atoms, causing a chain reaction of self-repeating splits and energy being released. After publishing and confirming their tests, other German scientists, including Otto Hahn, formed a program that is informally known as the Uranium Club. This group of scientists was funded under Nazi rule and became the Germany nuclear weapons program. At about the same time, there was a Hungarian-American physicist by the name of Leo Szilard. Now, Leo Szilard was actually the first scientist to come up with the idea of nuclear fission and its applications to a chain reaction, but he never published his findings. The reason for this is because he saw the potential for it to become a weapon. But he also knew that if he could think of these processes, then his colleagues in Germany could think of them too. So when he found out the success of the nuclear fission experiment conducted by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, Szilard was convinced it wouldn't be long until the Germans developed a bomb themselves. Because of this, Leo Szilard visited an old friend of his, Albert Einstein. Using Einstein's fame, they both wrote a letter to American President FDR, President Roosevelt. This letter brought the attention of the German atomic threat to America and was the direct cause of the start of the Manhattan Project. Founded in 1993, the United States started the Manhattan Project with the support of Great Britain and Canada. The Manhattan Project brought together some of the greatest minds physics has ever produced. Including Leo Szilard himself, which is over there. And the project grew to employ over 130,000 people spanning 30 sites. The project's total cost was about $2 billion, which translates to like $26 billion in today's money. But in May of 1945, the game changed, because Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. But despite that, the efforts to build an atomic bomb continued.
Until the atomic bomb could be tested, doubt would remain on its effectiveness. The world had never seen a nuclear explosion before, and its estimates varied widely on how much energy would be released. There was only enough weapons-grade uranium for one bomb, and the confidence in the gun-type design of this bomb was so great it wasn't tested, really. It was most of the uranium bomb Little Boy began its trip westward to the Pacific without its design having ever been fully tested. A test of the plutonium bomb, however, seemed vital, both to confirm its novel implosion design and to gather data on nuclear explosions in general. Several plutonium bombs were now in the pipeline and would be available over these next few weeks and months. It was therefore decided to test one of these. Robert Oppenheimer chose to name this the Trinity Test, a name inspired by the poems of John Donne. The site chosen was a remote corner on the El Alamogordo bombing range known as the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death, 210 miles south of Los Alamos. The elaborate instrumentation surrounding the site was tested with a large amount of conventional explosives on May 7th. Preparations continued through May and June and were completed by the beginning of July. 3 observation bunkers located 10,000 yards north, west, and south of the firing tower at Ground Zero would attempt to measure key aspects of the reaction. Specifically, scientists would try to determine the symmetry of the implosion as well as the amount of energy released. During the final seconds, most observers laid down on the ground with their feet facing the Trinity site and simply waited. Inside of the bunkers, observers actually placed bets on whether or not the bomb would be a dud, would actually explode successfully, incinerate New Mexico, or destroy the world's atmosphere. They really had no idea what would happen. At precisely 5:30 a.m. on Monday, July 16, 1945, the nuclear age began. While the Manhattan Project staff members watched anxiously, the device exploded over the New Mexico desert, vaporizing the tower and turning the asphalt around the base of the tower to green sand. Seconds after the explosion came a huge blast wave and heat searing out across the desert. No one could see the radiation generated by the explosion, but they all knew it was there. The steel container, Jumbo, weighing over 200 pounds and transported to the desert only to be eliminated from the test, was knocked ajar, even though it stood half a mile from Ground Zero. As the orange and yellow fireball stretched up and spread, a second column, narrower than the first, rose and flattened into a mushroom shape, thus providing the atomic age with a visual image that has become imprinted on the human consciousness as a symbol of power and awesome destruction. When Harry Truman learned of the success of the Manhattan Project, he knew he was faced with a decision of unprecedented gravity. The capacity to end the war with Japan was in his hands, but it would involve unleashing the most terrible weapon ever known to man. American soldiers and civilians were weary from years of war, but the Japanese military wouldn't give up the fight. American forces occupied Okinawa and Iwo Jima and were intensely firebombing Japanese cities, but Japan had an army of 2 million strong stationed in the home islands to prevent invasion. For Truman, the choice whether or not to use the atomic bomb was the most difficult decision of his life. First, an Allied demand for immediate, unconditional surrender was made to the leadership in Japan. Although the demand stated that refusal would result in total destruction, no mention of any new weapons of mass destruction were mentioned. The Japanese military command rejected the request of unconditional surrender, but there was indications that a conditional surrender was possible. Regardless, on August 6, 1945, a plane called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. Instantly, 70,000 Japanese citizens were vaporized. In the months and years that followed, an additional 100,000 perished from burns and radiation sickness. 2 days later, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, where 80,000 Japanese people perished. On August 14th, 1945, the Japanese surrendered. Critics have charged that Truman's decision was a barbaric act that brought negative long-term effects to the United States. A new age of nuclear terror led to a dangerous arms race. Some military analysts insist that Japan was already on its knees and the bombings were completely unnecessary. The American government was accused of racism on the grounds that such a device would never have been used on white citizens. Other critics argued that American diplomats had ulterior motives. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan, and the atomic bomb could be read as a strong message for the Soviets to tread lightly. In this respect, Hiroshima and Nagasaki may have been the first shots of the Cold War as well as the final shots of World War II. Regardless, the United States remains the only nation in the world to have used a nuclear weapon on another nation. The atomic bombings of the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan were conducted by the United States in the final stages of World War II in August 1945. The two bombings were the first and remain the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare. A single atomic bomb, the first weapon of its type ever used against a target, exploded over the city of Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945. Most of the industrial workers had already reported to work, but many were en route, and nearly all of the school children and some industrial employees were at work in the open on the program of building removal to provide fire breaks and disperse valuables throughout the country. The attack, ironically enough, came 45 minutes after the all clear had been sounded from a previous alert. Because of the lack of warning and the populace's indifference to small groups of airplanes, the explosion came as an almost complete surprise, and the people had not taken shelter. Many were caught out in the open, and most of the rest in flimsily constructed homes or commercial establishments. The bomb exploded slightly northwest of the center of the city. Because of this accuracy over the flat terrain and the circular shape of the city, Hiroshima was uniformly and extensively damaged. Practically the entire densely or moderately built-up portion of the city was leveled by the blast and swept by fire. A firestorm, or a phenomenon which has occurred infrequently in other conflagrations, developed in Hiroshima. Fires springing up almost simultaneously over the wide, flat ground and around the center of the city drew in air from all directions. The inrush of air easily overcame the natural ground wind, which had a velocity of only about 5 miles per hour. The fire wind attained a maximum velocity of 30 to 40 miles per hour in just the first, second, and third hours after the explosion. The fire wind and the symmetry of the built-up center of the city gave a roughly circular shape to the 4.4 square miles which were almost completely burned out. The surprise, the collapse of many buildings, and the conflagration contributed to an unprecedented casualty rate. 70 to 80,000 people were killed, or missing, presumed dead, and an equal number were injured. At Nagasaki 3 days later, the city was scarcely more prepared, though vague references to the Hiroshima disaster had appeared in the August 8th newspaper. Thus, only about 400 people were in the city's shelters, which were adequate for about 30% of the entire population of the city. When the atomic bomb exploded, an intense flash was observed first, as though a large amount of magnesium had been ignited, and the scene grew hazy with white smoke. At the same time, at the center of the explosion, and a short while later in other areas, a tremendous roaring sound was heard, and a crushing blast wave and intense heat were felt. The people of Nagasaki, even those who lived on the outer edge of the blast, all felt as though they had sustained a direct hit, and the whole city suffered damage such as would have resulted from direct hits everywhere with multiple bombs. This is a video of President Harry Truman telling America that he had released the bombs.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb, It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work.
The zero area where the damage was most severe was almost completely wiped out, and for a short while after the explosion, no reports came from that area of the city. People who were in comparatively damaged areas reported their condition under the impression that they had received a direct hit. If such a great amount of damage could be wreaked by a mere miss, then the power of the atomic bomb is unbelievably great. In Nagasaki, no firestorm arose, and the uneven terrain of the city confined the maximum intensity of damage to the valley over which it was exploded. The area of nearly complete devastation was thus much smaller, only about 1.8 square miles. Casualties were lower as well. Between 35,000 and 40,000 people were killed, and about the same number injured. People in the tunnel shelters escaped injury unless exposed to the entrance shaft. The people hit point blank or close were instantly incinerated, blown to ashes. Farther out, miles in any directions, people suffered third-degree burns that were sometimes fatal, as well as the radiation given from the bomb. This is a video of an atomic explosion, and there is no sound.
The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had many lasting effects on both Japan and the entire world. Many people were killed, not instantly, but years after the bombing from cancer or wounds. Though exposure to radiation can cause near immediate effect by killing cells and directly damaging tissue, radiation can also have effects that happen on a longer scale, such as cancer, by causing mutations in the DNA of living cells. Mutations can occur spontaneously, but a mutagen like radiation increases the likelihood of a mutation taking place. In theory, ionizing radiation can deposit a molecular bond-breaking energy which can damage DNA, thus altering genes. In response, a cell will either repair the gene, die, or retain that mutation. In order for a mutation to cause cancer, it is believed that a series of mutations must occur in the same cell. For this reason, it takes many years before an increase in cancer due to radiation comes to light. There are many people killed by cancer and radiation after the war. There's a large spike in leukemia victims about 5 years after the war, and many people died of other cancers. The nuclear bombs had a lasting effect on the environment. The radioactive particles can sometimes reach 100 kilometers into the air, and they can stay up there for 1 to 5 years. It can only take 3 weeks for these particles to potentially get all the way around the world. So that means in less than a month, they can be in the clouds above America, they can be floating through England, or they could be in the ground in Greenland. Sometimes the radioactive particles will fall as precipitation in acid rain, and sometimes it slowly settles on the ground, on plants or animals, and contaminates it that way. Many animals were killed via the bombings, to injuries or cancer. The animals, just like humans, are prone to leukemia and other cancers, and they're also susceptible to genetic disorders in their offspring, so just like humans. The ozone layer, which surrounds the Earth and protects us from harmful ultraviolet radiation, was reduced by about 2% just from the 2 bombings on Japan. Looking into the future, some scientists say that nuclear weapons pose the single biggest threat to the Earth's environment. Speaking at the American Geophysical Union's meeting in San Francisco in December 2006, Richard Turco of UCLA said that detonating between 50 and 100 bombs, only 0.03% of the world's arsenal, would throw enough soot into the atmosphere to create a climactic anomaly unprecedented in human history. The cost of damage done by the atomic bomb was very high. To clean up and rebuild the cities, it was about $2 billion in each city. That's over $50 billion in today's money just to recuperate from the bombs. The use of atomic bombs to end World War II has been hotly debated. The supporters state that many Japanese and Americans would have been killed had the bomb not been used. According to them, the only alternative to bombing Japan was to potentially sacrifice 1 million more American and many more British lives as well, which was not a good trade. They think that using the atom bombs was preferable to invasion. Historian Robert P. Newman concluded that each month the war continued in 1945, about 250,000 civilians would be killed just from fire bombings and other military actions. He said that the speedy end to the war actually saved civilian lives. On the other hand, those who oppose the bombing think that not only was the use of atomic weaponry to end World War II unnecessary, but also immoral. They declare that while the bomb finished the war, it was far too devastating to be considered decent. It claimed way too many innocent lives and crossed a moral line in warfare. Most of the scientists and people involved in the development of the atomic bombs disagreed with its use against civilian cities in Japan, but military advisors overlooked the scientists and used them anyways. The development of the atom bomb brought tension to an all-time high in the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States both threatened each other with atomic weapons. It was a prolonged battle of wills, posturing, and threats between Communist Russia and the United States of America. Although no direct military conflict between the two nations ever ensued, the world was caught up in the constant threat of nuclear proliferation. It wasn't until two men assumed power in each nation that a recognition of the need for change began. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev would change the world forever by ending the Cold War. Each charismatic leader inspired the people and each other to bring about change by tearing down the separating divides. Here's a short video to explain the Cold War.
Oh, Lisa. Why don't you?
Okay. I know you might be thinking that's kind of a ridiculous video and it might not be true, but let me be the first to tell you that is exactly what happened. That was the Cold War. No, but in all seriousness, the Cold War lasted all the way to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, but the threat of atomic bombs has lasted all the way to today.
Although it has been highly debated since the United States' decision on the atomic bombs on Japan and has gone down in history, after Albert Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt, the development of the bomb was inevitable. Years later, the decision on the drop of the bomb was pondered. With many people both for it and against it, the choice was not easy. The bombs were dropped and many civilians were killed, but ended the war. The atomic bombs had many unforeseen consequences that lasted for decades after Japan surrendered. The atomic bombs had many unforeseen consequences that lasted decades after Japan surrendered. The decision is debated to this day, but one thing is for sure: atomic bombs changed the world forever.